With complete governing control in Albany, the Democratic Party has had little problem in implementing its broad policy agenda. Legalizing cannabis for adult use has been a priority for Democrats over the past 2 years. Assembly Majority Leader Crystal Peoples-Stokes, together with Senator Liz Krueger, have introduced legislation that would prioritize disadvantaged communities while implementing a broad regulatory framework for the production and sales of marijuana. Governor Andrew Cuomo has put forward a similar bill attempting to legalize through the budgetary process. Despite such efforts, however, the Democratic state Senate has been unable to secure a majority, reportedly 2 votes short as a result of 7 notable holdouts, 2 being from Westchester and 5 being from Long Island. Demographics, public opinion, and political realities in these suburban districts have made supporting legalization politically perilous. Now, this is the opening paragraph of a brilliantly written article by CSG hemp policy intern Sarah McGovern, a current student at Binghamton University. Here today to discuss this publication in depth is Sarah, and CEO of CSG Hemp and previous guest on Steve's Cannabis Show and host of the Empire State of Cannabis podcast, Kaylin Castetter. Kaylin and Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's a pleasure to come on the show. I think this is third time on the show? I think third time. It's always a great conversation.
And hopefully not the last.
Oh, hopefully not.
Well, I hope everybody's doing well in Binghamton and staying healthy. And Sarah, I just want to give you some props. I've found that over the last couple of years, I've had countless people ask me, so what the hell is going on with legalization in New York? And I've tried tirelessly to kind of articulate what you so beautifully did in that paper. And I'm really excited because now I feel like I have a resource to actually tell somebody succinctly on what the hell is actually going on. So beautifully done, CSG. You guys are doing some really good work out in Binghamton, and I'm excited to kind of dive into this issue. So the first question I have for you is, we mentioned in this intro, there are 7, players in this in this issue. Who are the senators in question?
Sure. So that'd be the 2 from Westchester, Senators Mayer and Harracum, and also the Long Island 6. Now, only 5 of the Long Island 6 were mentioned as being obviously opposed to it, but they're such a voting bloc that it's notable to mention all 6 of them. So that's Senators Goffrin, Brooks, Kaplan, Kaminsky, Thomas, and Martinez. So they're a voting bloc in Long Island, so they're all really important to mention here.
And I think both Kaylin and I have had the opportunity, both together and separately, to meet these senators in Albany and discuss the issues. And it is a bit of a political nightmare. And we're going to dive into kind of why it is such a nightmare. But tell me, what are the major concerns for these senators when it comes to legalization?
Sure. So they've all sort of mentioned the public health and safety concerns are the most pressing for their constituents and also for them. A lot of them have said that they would support if there was more education, if there was more of a plan to address potential DUIs that would come as a result, and more access just for the community to resources to ensure that this could be implemented in a safe way.
Yeah, and Steve, as we both know, the personal feelings almost get pushed aside for a lot of these representatives because of how difficult these districts are politically, and because, as Sarah was saying, these issues keep getting pushed by people who are opposed to legalization and pushing their own agenda.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's like their own, I won't say cult, but for simplicity, it's like they have their own little kind of political group down there that's, it seems like Long Island demographics is very different than the rest of the state, especially when it comes to legalization. We've heard the public safety, education, law enforcement. Personally, I'd love to see a lot of the revenues get poured back into education. I think that's kind of one of the foundational issues that we have as a country, let alone a state, to start to address. I have a little bit of issues, especially in the midst of what's going on with the BLM movement and kind of the disproportionality of arrests that have occurred in Black and brown communities, to start dumping money from cannabis revenues into law enforcement. I have a little bit of personal feelings about that, but regardless, it seems like, and not that it seems, they have a lot of power down there. And it seems like there's been some seriously strong oppositional organization going down there. What groups in particular are kind of a part of this organized opposition?
So it's mainly the PTA organizations as well as law enforcement. And, the PTA seems to have been the most outspoken against legalization.
Yeah, why does the PTA have so much power down there? I don't see a lot of the PTA members up here kind of making as much of a stink and having much of an influence when it comes to legalization as they do downstate. What is it about downstate that allows them to have so much pull?
Well, I definitely think that downstate, especially in the suburbs, they've shown that they really don't support legalization the way that the rest of the state does. In a Siena poll, 58% statewide support legalization, whereas only 44% do in suburbs. And that's where these PTAs are being especially vocal. So I think it's a lot of just harnessing all of those concerns that are there. And they're just loud voices, and they're really making their voices heard in these areas where it's just not supported.
Yeah, and two things to add: organization and fear, right? So they're expert at getting organized, getting their message out to a large swath of people. And then that second part, fear, right? When you bring in children and you say, well, this is going to harm our future generations, that stokes a lot of fear. And it's turned now into a slowing down of the process and of let's just focus on medical, maybe let's slow this legalization process down, let's think of a million reasons why this shouldn't get done. And then you have organizations like Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which will jump on that message and continue to perpetuate the kind of misinformation.
Yeah, the what about the kids argument has been something we've been confronted from the last couple of years, and studies continue to come out. And I believe I saw one. Was it Marijuana Moment that or maybe MJ Biss? I just saw a publication come out recently that said there has been no increase in youth use of cannabis since legalization in Colorado. Like, at what point are the facts just kind of being ignored, and they're really just playing this, preying on people's emotions? Because we know that there is an increase in traffic fatalities related to cannabis. We know that there isn't an increase in youth use following legalization. At what point do they concede, or do you think, will they ever?
Well, I think also, Steve, it's important. Let's look at what these opponents don't want to talk about, which is the effects on mental health of children who grow up believing their parents are criminals because they consume cannabis, right? Or children who grow up in a broken household because the justice system is taking their parents away from them and incarcerating them for cannabis, something that large multinational, multi-state companies are turning, millions of dollars of profit in. So they don't want to talk about that yet. Like you said, they want to point to statistically flawed studies or just an emotional appeal.
Yeah, and as much as I don't want to admit it, it has worked, and it really has been kind of the opposition and kind of preventing us from getting this forward. I believe that we would have gotten it passed through the budget process this year if it wasn't for COVID. Obviously, kind of the legislative session is a bit up in the air right now and kind of undefined. But let's hope for next year. I hope that we can continue to educate these folks, and it's just one of those things. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it Pete Harcum or was it Senator Gauguin that recently came on board and said that we now had his vote? I think it was Harcum, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was Harcum too. He recently said that after, being outwardly against it. So it was interesting to see that.
Yeah, and I remember seeing a video. I was pretty stewed up following last year's failed effort because Kevin Thomas, when he ran, partly ran on a pro-legalization platform. I remember seeing an interview where he directly supported, legalization, and then to come through and, be one of the deciding votes that prevents an entire state from, capitalizing on this, multifaceted industry is very frustrating. I understand you got to play the political game. It's frustrating nonetheless.
No, it's absolutely frustrating because we have lives on the line, we have an economy on the line, and it is not just another political issue for those of us in the industry and for communities that continue to face, persecution because of this plant. And Sarah talks about that too, and the racial disparities and arrests in these communities really, I think, go hand in hand in why these lawmakers maybe and the community at large isn't driven towards legalization.
Yeah, and I really want to kind of dive into the nitty gritty of because it's we wrote a paper a while back. It was Rock Normal, not we, formerly we, Rock Normal Drug Policy Alliance wrote a really powerful paper about the disproportionality of arrests in Monroe County and the city of Rochester. But the reality is it's not just happening here. It's happening in Binghamton, and it's especially happening in Long Island and the downstate suburbs. Can you kind of elaborate on what we see from a legal perspective and how, people of color and black and brown communities are being prosecuted versus white folks, and kind of cannabis, the prevalence of cannabis usage amongst these different folks?
Sure. So in Westchester County, although it's 55% white, only 14% of arrests are of white members of the community, whereas the demographics are 14% black, but they're making up 52% of arrests. So it's completely disproportionate. And it's a similar thing among Hispanic members of the community. 24% of the population, 32% of arrests. So it's, for white people living in these communities, they're not facing the same challenges that black members of the community are. And for essentially, cannabis and adult use is essentially already legal for white people. And it's the same thing in Nassau and Suffolk counties. Very similar breakdown. 60% white in Nassau, 30% black and Hispanic in Nassau. And we see the exact flip of the numbers. 30% of arrests are white, 60% of arrests are black and Hispanic. And the numbers are very similar in Suffolk. So across the board in these New York suburbs, black and brown communities are suffering to an utmost degree, whereas the white communities are barely affected, which affects the urgency that those communities feel to legalize.
And especially in what we're going through right now following George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement around the country, I think people are starting to realize how much cannabis legalization and cannabis criminalization is ingrained in police reform, right? People like myself, a middle-class white dude, I've never felt the effects of criminalization of cannabis. I've got to be honest, I've never once worried in my entire life about getting arrested or going to jail for cannabis. I'm aware of the privilege, and a lot of people that look like me are aware of that too. But when you start looking at these other communities, you walk outside, you have a possession of a joint or something ludicrous or something, minimal, your whole life could be uprooted. And at what point are we going to realize and come to terms that, while legalizing cannabis isn't going to solve the, institutional racism and everything that comes with it, it's a damn good start. But these folks on Long Island, we see the demographics. It doesn't really affect the people that are living there. So how do we instate this sense of urgency to get to them to see how the other half lives and how the other half is being affected? Is it possible?
Well, I think, Steve, it's very important to look at the arguments that these, especially smart approaches to marijuana is making. And what did they say last year and the year before? Decriminalization. Well, we have decriminalization, and yet I think a new report came out in Albany, 80-some% of arrests were people of color, right? Decriminalization is not enough. We need to regulate the industry, and this isn't just for us, but in the interest of public safety, for economic benefit, but also so that we take away the criminal element. Even if you have decriminalization, there still needs to be a place where people purchase their cannabis. And unfortunately, the realities are that when the police and law enforcement come in and prosecute those crimes for sales, it's almost always a person of color. And what they're doing is involving themselves in a marketplace, in an industry that is celebrated at the higher echelons of the private equity markets and these companies all across the country. So it's time to allow them and what we call the legacy marketplace, or the informal marketplace, to participate in this, large accumulation of wealth and create generational wealth.
And I think, a lot of the times when we talk about, cannabis legalization is full spectrum when it comes to the positives it can bring to the state and communities. And oftentimes I think that when we talk about, the economic improvements, we're only really looking at the plus side, the revenues. But the reality is, when we're, looking at this deficit and what cannabis can be, how cannabis legalization can be used as a tool, yeah, we can expect some exorbitantly high revenues to come from this industry. But what about the money saved? What about the cost savings of police no longer having to enforce and prosecute, and all the tying up the legal system with these low-level marijuana crimes? I don't know what the numbers are, but my guess is if you look at the cost savings from the criminalization of cannabis and the revenues from the legalization and the rec market and everything that comes with that at what was, pre-COVID, a $13 billion budget deficit starts to look a lot smaller. Do you have any idea, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, I'm just not sure, how much New York State spends from a law enforcement perspective on prosecuting and persecuting low-level marijuana crimes?
I don't think we have that data, but I think it's going to be hard to figure that out because it's beyond just what their costs are in terms of the hours in the court and et cetera, but what is the cost to society and the cost on individuals if the police have to look at cannabis as probable cause for a crime? And that's very difficult to put numbers on and quantify.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, you start looking at like what happens from the time you get pulled over. It's you get pulled over, you take your, you're taking up the cops' time. You go to the station, you get booked. You sit in a cell. You have to go back to court. Like, even if it ended up to be nothing, right? You're holding up the legal system for things, for crimes that police resources should be focused on. You're possibly destroying these folks' lives. And at the very least, it's a huge headache and inconvenience. And it's just like, at what point are we just going to drop this shit and start looking at cannabis as a medicine and a wellness product and a means to, economic prosperity for all communities rather than, a criminalized plant? We could go on about it forever, and I don't want to take up any more time, on this, but it is something that I think, looking forward, and I think probably in 5 to 6 years, hopefully when it's legalized, we're going to start looking at like, man, remember that time that people used to go to jail for this shit? It's quite amazing, and it does keep me up at night. But I really want to kind of get down to the politics of legalization and start looking at the politics from a 30,000-foot view. So, Sarah, if you would, can you kind of break down the politics of legalization in Long Island and kind of what that looks like?
Sure, absolutely. So as I said, because of these people aren't really feeling the effects of prohibition of adult legalization, there's not that urgency to legalize, and therefore there's no urgency to legalize from the representatives themselves. The districts in Long Island are really tough districts. I talk about in the article a little bit about PVI scores, and basically as that score gets closer and closer to zero, it shows how the split is in the district, Democrat versus Republican. So a lot of these districts are almost an even split, which means they're crazy competitive. So when those elections come around, that representative who may be an incumbent still doesn't have the assurance that they're going to win that election. And the Long Island Six, a lot of them only just got into office in 2018. So they're a new representative, and they definitely have the feeling that if they support a controversial issue like adult use legalization, they're putting their reelection on the line. They're afraid that by supporting something like this, they're going to lose those important votes that they need to win in these really competitive districts.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's already a tough district. It's already very much, not as truly democratic as the rest of the state. And as a new politician, if you want to make any sort of career in politics, you have to play the game. And I would venture to say maybe not all, but probably most of the Long Island Six personally probably would prefer to legalize cannabis, but obviously have to follow the wishes of their constituency.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's tough. I would not like like to be a politician, especially in that realm where it's a very tough demographic. I will say I was very ignorant to the partisan voter index that you break down. It was really educational. I really appreciate you doing that, because I really had no idea that exists. So if we could just back up real quick, can you give like a brief, overview of what the partisan voter index means, just for all my listeners?
Sure. So, Partisan Voter Index, or PVI, is actually a federal measure that measures the federal congressional districts within every district across the country, and every single district has a score. So, like I said, as that score gets closer to zero, it's more and more competitive. So, for example, one district in Long Island is D+1. So that means it's Democratic leaning by 1 point, which is very, very competitive. Another district might be R+2, so it's Republican leaning, but because that 2 is still really close to zero, it's still really competitive. So that's what we see all throughout Long Island, those really competitive congressional districts, which translate to very competitive local elections as well.
So it's fair to say that the higher number means the less competitive. Like if you had a D+10, you're almost guaranteed to win a Democratic seat. Where if you're a D+1, it's essentially up for grabs. It's a coin flip. Interesting. Very cool. I did not know that. And kind of last question. We're in the middle. Hopefully coming out of COVID and a return to normalcy to some extent. Can you guys provide an update on current legalization efforts? I had Savino on the podcast a few months ago to kind of discuss what's going on with COVID and how this is all working. Do you have any updates on what's happening? Finishing out the session in 2020 and looking to 2021.
Yeah, so I don't think it looks good, Steve, for 2020, right? I think 2021 is the magic year. It's an off year, so some of these representatives won't feel the pressure of the elections. And there's just going to be such a need for it from a revenue perspective. The governor needs to look at the MRTAC version and move his plan there, because that's what's going to get it done. We need to look at revenue allocations. At least half of the revenue is going to have to go to disadvantaged communities. And I think that on the legislative side, they should look at specific programs to set up for that and to point to. But I think the rest is probably going to have to go to the general fund. Because we're going to need that. And the MRTA also allows for local distribution and county distribution of tax revenue. That's going to be critical, right? And the tax rates are lower too. So if we want to get an industry off the ground and competitive with the illicit marketplace, it's going to have to look like the MRTAC. And if the governor comes in on some of those issues, it gets done. It gets done in the budget process. And if the governor wants it done in the budget process, it gets done. So I'm hopeful, but this is also year 3 of being hopeful.
Sick of waiting, especially that was it just Montana that qualified to put legalization on the ballot this November?
Yep.
There's a chance that we're going to have Montana legalized before us.
Well, New Jersey is going to pass this fall, no doubt.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good thing, because it should light a fire under the butts of the legislature and the governor. Like, hey, Massachusetts is legal, New Jersey it's legal. It's only a matter of time. We don't want to be the last man standing or the last folks standing, because most people, it's already hard enough to establish a business in New York, and if they have the ability to operate on the outskirts of New York and all these legal states, why come here? So I do think it's going to be 2021. I also think it's going to be in the budget process, but where they negotiate, in terms of allocation and distribution is still up in the air. I really appreciate both coming on the show today and taking time to explain this. Sarah, thank you so much. You did a brilliant job. You did what I haven't been able to explain over 2 years easily and brilliantly and articulately, and I thank you very much. Kaylin, keep doing the good work you guys are doing at CSG. Always love seeing what you guys have going on social media and all the good work that you're doing. So thank you both so much for coming on the show today. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Steve. It was a pleasure.
Yeah,
Alrighty, everybody.
You for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. This wraps up another episode, special episode of Steve's Cannabis Show with Sarah McGovern and Kaylin Castetter, both of CSG Hemp, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks again.